Well, right now we're going to continue our conversation on innovation and collaboration. And we've got a special guest with us here today. We've got Social Futurist Mal Fletcher with us.
Mal, first of all, tell us, what is a social futurist?
A social futurist is somebody who tracks changes in ethics, in technology, in values, and really through an understanding of history begins to extrapolate that into the future and say, if we continue along that line, where will we be in 10, 15 or 20 years? And I think for Christian leaders, we have to stop simply managing the present and celebrating the past, and we have to engage the future. It's the only way to shape the future, especially those of us who are generational leaders here today.
Yeah,
Love that. Okay, so we are going to go into the future, but before we do that, let's go back into the past, because before you were a social futurist, you were a youth pastor, right?
I was indeed, yes.
For Youth Alive, it went from 300 young people to over 60,000 people, and it is now a global organisation.
Yeah, it started in 1982. I was a youth leader fresh out of university, and we just had nowhere to take young people that was friendly to local church, but didn't look like local church. So we started having these events with 300 young people. Half of them were from my youth group in one venue. Then we started to grow to 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. We started filling indoor football stadiums. And other people in the country got interested. So I invited them all into Melbourne for a forum, a summit for 2 days. And talk about innovation, that just exploded in those 2 days. We came out of that with a plan for Youth Alive Australia, whereas it had previously only been Youth Alive in my state. And then it grew in all the other cities. It went to New Zealand, it went to Asia and Europe, gave birth to things like Planet Shakers under Russell Evans, who was a Youth Alive guy. Phil Dooley was in Youth Alive. Gary Clark was in Youth Alive. So many people were involved, and it's great to see what God has done. Never allow anybody to tell you, if you're in generational ministry, that it's just a stepping stone to something else.
Yes.
I mean, there are thousands of leaders today around the world because of that simple act of obedience of bringing leaders together from around Australia.
It's great.
That's incredible. Now we're joined here now with a load of youth and young adult leaders from across the UK. And we've been discussing a lot of trending topics, social media, technology, stuff like that. But really, let's get into the generations. You got Gen Z and you got millennials. Tell me, what is the difference between them both?
Well, let's define some terms first of all, Dan. Gen Z, we call them Generation Edge because this generation is on the edge of some of the biggest challenges and opportunities that have faced humankind in the last 100 to 200 years. And the major difference between millennials, who are aged 35 to about 18 in the UK, and anything under that, 17 and under, we would call Generation Edge. They're quite different in a lot of ways, but here's two for you. Millennials are much more idealistic than Generation Edge. Generation Edge is much more pragmatic. It's much more, we don't want to hear the dream, we don't want just the vision, we want to know how it's going to happen. And you can see that with under 16s even now. We want you to give us some pragmatic, measurable projects that will make a change in society. The other big difference is that Generation Edge are reformists by nature. And they don't see rebellion as baby boomers, my generation, used to do. Hey, I'm cool, I'm rebellious. You know, look at my music, it's rebellious, my clothes are rebellious. Well, not anymore, but they were once. They're not like that. They don't wear it as an outward badge of identity. They see rebellion as a way of bringing reform, especially in the digital space. So you won't see these kids going out and demonstrating in the street as much, but you will see them changing things online, which means that we as leaders have to take very seriously what they say and do online.
Wow, incredible. All right, well, we'll open it up to the floor and we'll see what questions you guys have and go from there.
Awesome. So yeah, just thinking about kind of, you know, some of the issues that a lot of this generation faces in terms of like stress and anxiety and depression. Statistics would say that 70% of the generation, you know, it's increased over the past 25 years in that. A lot of people would think that the factor would be social media and technology, but, you know, if that was all kind of removed, do you think the problems would still remain?
I think the problem would still remain. However, I have to say that social media is an exacerbating factor. There's plenty of evidence now, for example, that social media can make you feel down. Facebook in particular has been researched a lot in the United States. And the reason for that is that on social media, obviously, you're seeing someone's idealized life. You're not seeing their real life, which leaves many of us feeling, well, why is my life not quite matching up to these other people? Why am I so dull? Why is my Instagram feed so dull? There's time starvation too. You know, people are more prone to be depressed when they don't get enough sleep. And in this country of Great Britain, 40% of children who own a smartphone today don't get enough sleep. Wow. there are children under 5 now, according to one of our leading psychiatrists, who exhibit autism-like symptoms. They're not autistic, but they have autism-like behaviour because they can't read human faces. Wow. They can't get eyeball signals. They can't do old-fashioned biometrics. They're so used to multi-screening. So I think the problem would still be there because of the pressures of life today. And a lot of it has to do with the family, because parents now are using social media so much they don't have time to eyeball their children, to spend time with their children. And so those two things working together do make it very difficult for kids today to handle depression.
Just following on from that as well, really, just how would you, youth pastor many years ago, but even now, if you were a youth pastor now, how would you be encouraging your team to lead in a way, and I guess to help safeguard your young people to media, social media, to not help it exploit these often insecurities?
I think one of the things I would do, it's going to sound like a strange answer to your question, but it won't if you think about it later. I would teach young people what the Lordship of Christ means. That Jesus is my friend, but he's not my buddy. Right. Dan's my friend, and we could become buddies. But Jesus isn't like that. He's my Lord. Great. Kurios in Greek means someone who has the right to make a demand and have it fulfilled. Right. Now, Dan and I are not like that, but Jesus and I have to be. He's called Master, the one who has the unreserved right for everything I have, no questions asked. If we begin ourselves to understand that, it changes our attitude to servanthood, doesn't it? If we get our young people to begin to understand that, he's your friend, but he's not your buddy. He doesn't play let's make a deal, let's do your thing 3 days a week and mine the other 4, okay? Comes back to what you were saying. He's the Lord of my life. He has the right to say, because I died for you, you owe this. Now, I'm not saying he necessarily addresses it that way, but Paul says we have to become like slaves to righteousness. Slaves. We never use that word anymore in a positive sense. But what he's saying is, I can't find a better example to give you than this one we see in the marketplace every week in Rome, slaves. We've got to give ourselves to Christ unreservedly. And I think when we do that, some of these problems start to come into context then for young people. They start to get it. You know, even social media starts, oh yeah, well, that has to be subjected to Christ. What does that mean? How do I get involved in social media in a way that doesn't reflect badly on the Lord Jesus? And that changes everything.
Do you think there's a way in which people can share their faith successfully and effectively on those platforms? What would you suggest?
I think the best way to share your faith on those platforms, in fact, the best way to use those platforms, full stop, is to try always to add value to someone else. Yeah, great. Never, I get, to be honest with you, quite annoyed with some youth leaders and church leaders, only because they're using these media to promote what's happening on Sunday. So you get all these photos of, you know, people with their hands raised and great stage sets. And Youth Alive was all about that, so I believe in that. But, you know, people think, well, so what? My club has music. You know, my football club has music. Come on, my kids' school has music. What's the big deal? We need to tell unique stories that add value to people who are reading them. Yeah. And I think if Christians go out there just to tell, hey, I'm a Christian, yada, 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 I wouldn't even listen to that. Yeah. But if someone says something that adds value to me and makes me improve my skill set, increases my life skills, then I think I'm learning from that, which, by the way, then brings them to the point where they give permission for me to say something every so often that is a promotion. People don't mind promotion as long as it comes in the context of a lot of value-adding material.
You touched on technology, and so I think we should go there. If I've got my phone here, when I'm preaching, I will look around on a Sunday and I'll see a lot of people on their phones, and they'll say to me they're taking notes, but no one takes notes like this. we all know what they're doing. So the second screen has become a massive part of life. Like even going to the cinema, even if you guys, I'm sure at home watching Netflix, you might be having your phone, texting at the same time. Yeah. The second screen has become a massive part of our life. Yeah. Do you think in church we should embrace the second screen experience by somehow having an app where you can be interactive throughout the service? Or is it something where we keep telling them, put your phone away, focus on God?
Harnessing technology is important because in the 60s, some of you might have heard of a famous communications expert, a guru, they used to call him, called Marshall McLuhan, who famously said in the age of television, the medium is become the message. What he meant was that in the age of technology, the tools we use to communicate our ideas are just as important as the words we choose. So you might have a great idea, a great product, a great concept, but if the pipeline that you're sending that through is out of date, people will assume the idea is out of date. So we need to use as many modern texts as we can, because we don't want people thinking the God we represent is redundant or out of date. Sometimes Christians push the pause button and they say, listen, we need to think about the future implications of present technologies. That's a good role for the church. But we're not anti-progress. What we're anti is progressivism, which is the worship of progress. The idea that all progress must be good, all change must be good. That's not true. We need to use the technology, we need to harness it for that reason. But we need to humanize it. People at the forefront of technology from all over the world are saying we need proximity as well as technology. We need to have high touch in the age of high tech.
Mal, you talked about identity just in that last question. How as leaders can we lead these millennials who are going through life unsure of identity?
I think probably millennials measure identity in three things. The first is narrative, which we mentioned a moment ago. Narrative, because they are a narrative generation and almost every form of information has some narrative attached as it comes to them. So when they go for a job, there's plenty of evidence now that they're not just thinking, how much will you pay me? Or how many paid vacation days will I get? They're thinking, how can this job give me a better story to tell about myself? How can your network of connections, the experiences you're giving me, help me tell a better story about who I am? So narrative is one. Altruism is another. 93% of American consumers now say that they would much rather buy from a company that believes in a cause they care about. And the number's even higher among millennials. And that's where fair trade coffee came from. Millennials saying, we want to know when we consume, we're also activists. We're not just consumers. This is an activist action here. We're wanting to know we're doing good for someone out there in Africa or China or somewhere else. So altruism's another one. And we can offer all three, by the way, as Christian leaders. And the third one is trust. Because millennials are a much more nurtured generation than either of the two that went before them. I know I'm speaking generally now, and there are exceptions to this, but they're much better parented than Generation X or Boomers were before them. And because of that, they put a premium on trust. They expect that if I'm given the right tools, I should be allowed to get on with the job and not be micromanaged all the time. That's why they're driving the search for a new ethic in society. It's the millennials driving that, because they put a premium on trust. And so they see their identity as, in part, about how much trust I'm being shown here. How much trust is my youth leader putting in me when he or she gives me something to do? That's a key factor in shaping my sense of identity.
Let's chat feedback, because I personally, I love feedback. If, let's just say my line manager, my boss, my pastor was to sit down and say, hey Dan, when you did this, it wasn't good, you should do it like this. I'll be like, thank you very much, I really appreciate that. When I do the same with someone who's 10 years younger than me, say, hey mate, when you did this, it caused this, why don't you try like this? Sulk, go quiet, get offended, get moody with me, keep their distance from me, because I don't really feel like they do want the feedback. But are you saying they are open to feedback, or is it a certain type of feedback?
Well, you're talking about young millennials when you talk about people 10 years younger than you. And I guess there's a sense in which we have to always have a context to any correction that we give or any suggestions that we give. And I know you personally, Dan, so you would give the context. A lot of leaders don't, though. There's no context, there's no relationship. Right. It's just, hey, and millennials feel the same when boomers do that to them, when there's no sense of you have my best interests at heart, so I'm open to you. But I think a lot of it has to do, in other cases, just with insecurity, with a sense that I don't even know who I am yet, and yet you're pulling me down. That's not what you're doing, but that's what they feel that you're doing. And I think only time, I wouldn't say back off, I would say continue to be forthright, because it shows you care. But, give them time to adjust to the fact that someone's actually doing this to me. No one's ever done this for me before.
So I don't know what you guys think about that. I know with my wife, if I've got a piece of lettuce in my tooth, she'll say, Dan, you've got some lettuce in your teeth. And I really appreciate that, because I know she's saying it to help me rather than hurt me. I hope that whenever I'm leading someone maybe 10 years younger than me, they know I'm saying something, even if it is a critique, I'm saying it to help them rather than hurt them. And because hopefully I've invested positive over all those months and years, that one bit of criticism, they know it's like for the right reason. But how are you guys finding giving feedback?
I think for me, in my context, I find a lot of millennials, maybe people a little bit younger than me, become very defensive. Like, you're telling me something, I've done it wrong, and I should have got it right straight away. I kind of find that because we're, as a society, we're very results-based. And so if I don't get it right the first time, then I've failed. And that becomes their kind of stance point of defensive, that, you know, I've got to justify why I did it, or there's an excuse, someone else didn't do it, or whatever. And I really find that, even in my own life, just thinking about, I'm led by my dad, which is amazing and terrible at the same time. And so I would try and get my approval from my dad, in terms of, you know, I want to do everything right. And so when I'd made a mistake and he'd come to me, I'd just become very defensive about that because I didn't want to fail him or anything like that. And so my experience is that I have to kind of try and break that defensive nature by saying it's okay to make a mistake to this generation, that it's okay that you make mistakes.
I think as well, something that I've certainly seen is that a lot of sort of Generation Edge, because they have a lot of easy access to knowledge, they know a lot but don't have a lot of experience, and so you try and kind of critique and challenge, and they feel that they know better than you in some ways. And I think it's teaching them and helping them and enabling them to have the experience that matches up to the knowledge that they have, and then giving them a safe platform to fail off of the back of that, and really trying to support them a little through that experience. But it can be a real challenge, I find.
I think it's always cool to link it through relationship as well, in terms of when it comes to feedback, is if you're doing a journey with them and the young people, young adults know that you care, they're more willing to listen. But in terms of failure, I think sometimes when you have a goal in mind or a vision, that also helps too, so that they can understand that there's a bigger picture here than just my part that I'm playing, but what we're doing together is actually helping other people.
Testimonies and stories are influential, and powerful. I think looking at the future, they can be the leading pioneers of people coming to Christ. Do you think that social media has a platform for people to be influenced as well?
Well, millennials and Gen Edges are actually both narrative generations, much more than the ones that went before. Almost every form of meaningful information that comes to a millennial, like most of you today, and the Gen Edges that you lead, has a narrative attached, if you think about it. Whether it's a song is usually a narrative, a video clip is a narrative, a news story now, a shorter and shorter narrative. Social media, you mentioned, is a form of narrative, stream of consciousness style. I'm telling my story in little bits over a period of time. So the narrative is very important to these generations. So we need to communicate through narrative, but we need to add to that systematic truth, which means, I don't mean we give 3-point sermons, but I mean we don't just tell stories. There comes a time when you have to do what Paul did on Mars Hill, use the story to bring you to a point about truth and to explain.
When it comes to young millennials who have different passions and aspirations in life, whether it's to become an artist or a sports person, when that passion or that goal takes them away from church, how can we best support them?
That's a great question. And it happens a lot, doesn't it? I think, first of all, we do our best to make sure that doesn't happen,
Right.
which means celebrating those gifts within the church, but not just on Sunday.
Right.
Celebrating them in other ways, you know, getting behind them, speaking about them in public. Have you heard about what John's doing? John, come up quickly and tell us what you've just done in the arts this week. You know, that sort of thing. Making videos about them, putting them up on YouTube, telling their stories.
Right.
But also when it does happen, and it often does, I think we need to ensure that these young people understand you're still a Christian whatever you do.
Yeah.
As long as you stay within grace and live by truth and don't walk outside of Christ, you're a Christian whatever you do. You carry Christ wherever you go. What I'm concerned about is that you carry Christ wherever you go and that you live up to that high and holy calling. So, all right, if you want to go and play in a nightclub, I don't want you to play in a nightclub because I don't think it's good for you and I don't think you're ready for it. And I don't think it's an environment you need to be in. But if you go and do that, I can't make that choice. You've got to make your own independent choice. That's a maturity thing to do. But in doing that, you have to understand, you must be able to look at yourself in the mirror at the end of the night and say, I took Jesus tonight somewhere he would want to go.
Wow.
And that's sort of, see, I think sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, what we do from the pulpit or even in Christian TV, especially in Christian TV, is we make people think like they have to keep coming back to us for their answers.
Yeah.
Our role in preaching should be to teach them independent thinking.
Right.
So when we're not there to tell them what movies to see, they can make a wise choice, an ethical choice. So it comes down to that for me.
How do you think Jesus would use Instagram if he had it?
I've always said, when Twitter first came out, which was a bit before Instagram, that he would have been a great tweeter because so much of what he said can be said in less than 120, much less 140 characters. I think on Instagram, the challenge with Instagram and Snapchat and things like that is that the selfie started out with a good motive, and the motive was to life log, to tell my story, as I said, one piece at a time, one image at a time. But now for many people, it's become not just life logging, it's self-propaganda. Right. It's sort of telling my story, but in a hyper-realistic way, and which does provoke other people to feel depressed and perhaps a bit envious. And I think as Christians, we need to teach young people to go back to 1 Corinthians 13. Love does not puff itself up. It doesn't puff itself up. The word that's used there means to puff yourself up in a way that provokes envy in other people. Wow. Jesus said that the Pharisees were like painted tombs, all shiny on the outside and dead on the inside. You know, and that, a lot of Instagram and Snapchat is like that.
How do we get it so that the church is actually working together within generations, so that the old are working with the young, but the young are also working with the old?
That's a hard road. And there's a lot of creative tension goes on when generations work together, as long as people know it's creative. Pastors used to ask me, how do I get older people in my church to understand why so much of our music is young, so much of our preaching style is quite young? And I would say to them, well, the best way to do that is to explain to them that your church is about the future. You want their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren to know Jesus. Yeah. And there's hardly anybody that will argue with that. You want my grandchildren to know Jesus? Absolutely, I'm on board.
We've been talking about how to innovate like the right tradition, the right and the wrong traditions. How would you go about that conversation between the different generations about innovating the right things and not the wrong things?
It's a good question because I was asked by a BBC interviewer recently, what's a core characteristic of a futurist? And I said, well, one of them will surprise you. It's a drive to understand history. Because history always provides a context for the present and a platform for the future. Yeah. You know, somebody said, and it's true, if you don't know where you come from, you can't know where you're going, right? So an understanding of history is very important to young people. And I would encourage anyone working with young people today, like our guest here today, to teach young people history, particularly the history of the church, and make it come alive for them. Show them not just key pastors in history, but inventors and business people and you know, engineers and entertainers and artists. I mean, history's full of them. These are people who have what I call the pioneer spirit. But I think we as leaders also need to be careful we don't benchmark. What happens is that people in business and in church, we do it the same. We go to a conference, we see what someone else is doing in youth ministry, and we say, well, I'll borrow that without fully understanding it. I'll push that button and maybe get the same result, and we never do. That's called benchmarking. And there's a time to imitate others. It does help us. But it can, if we're not careful, lead us to look for the norm instead of the exception. And that's where our history, instead of being heritage, becomes baggage. Because we stop asking the why question. Even in contemporary church today, why do we preach the way we do every Sunday? Why are the same 5 chords the right chords to play in a worship song? Yeah, I can see you recognize that. Why is the same rhythm, you know, the right rhythm to play? We've got to ask the why question. That keeps us from heritage, which is a good thing, becoming baggage, which is not.
Wow, that's great. Yeah. Well, that's all we've got time for today. Just want to say a massive thank you to Mal Fletcher for being here. Absolutely incredible. So grateful. Thank you to all you guys, the youth and young adult leaders that are here today. Give yourselves a round of applause as well. We've had a great time together. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.